Hello to everyone. I hope you guys are doing well today. We are actually going to be starting a new module set. This will be module 4 for the next week. We're going to be focusing on tall tales and writing a literary essay. And we're going to be talking about various different pieces of the literary essay. And it's going to be based on the tall tales that we read. We're going to go back and be using our boxes and bullets, adding some evidence and kind of digging deeper into what evidence looks like. Be adding some characteristics in our evidence, adding quotes in our evidence. And these are all things that we've actually looked at, but we're just going to get a little bit more in detail. And as we know, throughout the year, we're just going to do a little bit. Next time we touch on it, it might be a little bit deeper and get more details so that by the end of the year, we'll be some amazing writers. First thing I want to do is I want to talk about this Tall Tales anchor chart. Well, I'm actually going to back up a little bit. I'm going to ask that you make sure that you have a copy of this anchor chart because we will be gluing it in our writing journals. I ask that you have a sheet of paper because I am going to read a story, and after we read the story, Pecos Bills and the Coyotes, we are going to be creating a boxes and bullets summary of that story, and then you will be given a story and you are going to do the same on your own with the boxes and bullets. So again, please make sure you have your writing journal, your Tall Tales anchor chart available, your glue, because you're going to be gluing this into your writing journal, not your grammar journal, your writing journal. We're going to glue it on page 10, and then we are going to do a boxes and bullets on a separate sheet of paper. I am also going to ask that you glue this into your journal on page 11, and then you will be given another story that we will also read and do the same thing all over again. So I'm going to model it with you, and then you're going to do it on your own, okay? So if you need to pause just to double check and make sure you have that, please only pause for about 10 to 15 seconds to gather it together, and then we'll get started. All right, getting back to Tall Tales anchor charts. So the purpose, and if you'll notice, it has it there, the purpose of a tall tale is to entertain by contrasting unlikely events with a straightforward style. So it's like me just telling you a true story, but nothing about the story can be real. We've already read a few others of them, but it sounds real, but there's no way that it can be real. Some of the elements that we look at are going to be the exaggeration for emphasis of a humorous effect, or also called a hyperbole. And we're just going to touch on that, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So this is the one that I was just talking about. It's the element is that it's an exaggerated humorous effect. The next thing we want to talk about is it has multiple variations as the tale is told and retold. So we've learned that as stories get told over and over and over again, they change just a little bit each and every time. People kind of put their own personal spin on it, and that's kind of what happens with tall tales as well. The next thing we look at is it's in a very unusual particular place in time. It's set specifically. It's also got some realistic detail, which highlights the fantastic exaggerated elements. So it's got things that are real in it, but it is combined with the exaggeration of things that couldn't be real. And then it has common speech or conversation style. And again, we know that having common speech or conversation style is also something that's pretty common with a realistic fiction. But keep in mind that a tall tale is not a realistic fiction. It just has it can have some realistic pieces in it, but the other pieces that are overly exaggerated kind of keep it from being a realistic fiction. And then the text structure is usually chronological, which means that everything kind of goes into an order, like it might start with being a baby, then a teenager, and then an adult. So it does flow in a chronological order, which kind of helps us make sense with it. So go ahead and take a moment, pause the video, and glue this Tall Tales anchor chart into your journal, your writing journal. I am going to ask that you glue it onto page 10. Okay. And then our table of contents is going to be, so let me write glue on page 10. So you're going to glue it onto page 10. And then our table of contents entry. And as I was going through some of y'all's journals last week, I noticed that some of you are not putting this on your table of contents, so please take a moment and do that as well. The day's date is September 18th. So go ahead on the date, put September 18th. We're going to call this the Tall Tales anchor chart. So it's Tall Tales anchor chart. And again, I'm asking that you glue this onto page 10. And if you think you already have something on page 10, then just kind of glue maybe the left edge of the anchor chart on the paper so that you can still lift it up and see what's underneath it. It's very much similar to what we did when I glued in our firefly stuff last week. So take a moment and do that. Try not to take more than about 30 seconds. And then we can continue on with our video reading Pecos Bill and the Tall Tales and then creating a boxes and bullet summary. Okay, getting back to our tall tale, Pecos Bill and the Coyotes. I am actually going to underline as I'm reading so that you can follow along with the story. And then remember, when we are done reading the story, we are going to create a boxes and bullets. I will walk you through it, so make sure that you have that sheet of paper available. Keep your writing journal handy because we'll go back and reference that as we're looking for evidence for our story. So here we go. We have Pecos Bill and the Coyotes. Now you've probably heard some things about Pecos Bill, like how he would eat dynamite for breakfast. Or maybe you know the story about him shooting the stars out of the sky. You've even heard about how he used a rattlesnake to lasso a twister of a tornado. But the story I'm going to tell you happened before all that. Pecos Bill was born in the back of a covered wagon, which was how people traveled back in those days. His parents had left New England, where the countryside was giving way to towns and becoming entirely too crowded for their taste. They were heading west to find their own home on the range, and his parents didn't name him Pecos Bill neither. That moniker came later. He was just their baby boy Billy. Billy was a bouncing baby boy, and he bounced so much and so high, he bounced right out of the back of that covered wagon as it was crossing the Pecos River. I am going to... It's not balanced, it's bounced. So I'm going to change this. All right. Go back to reading. He would most certainly have drowned if a coyote hadn't grabbed a hold of his diaper and pulled him to shore. Now, coyotes were known to eat babies, but this coyote just lost her own baby, pup, to a hungry hawk and felt motherly toward the soggy but otherwise fine baby boy. So she raised him as her own. Bill learned the wild ways of coyotes. When they howled at the moon, Bill howled right along with them. When they howled at the moon, Bill howled right along with them. When they chased bighorn sheep, Bill was at the head of the pack. And when they snuggled up to go to sleep, Bill was smack dab in the middle where it was the warmest and coziest. Bill's coyote days almost ended years later, when a cowboy almost rode right over him while Bill was napping by the side of the Pecos River. Bill springs up onto all fours, acting as ferocious as a wild coyote can act when face to face with a cowboy. But instead of being clean with fear, the cowboy burst out laughing. "Now ain't you something?" he said, tossing Bill a hat. "I'm your brother Bob, and our parents are going to be happy to get you back." "My brothers walk on all fours," says Pecos Bill, but Bob showed him their reflections in the river, and Pecos Bill couldn't deny the family resemblance. So he put on his hat, climbed onto the back of his brother's horse, and rode away with him to the sweetest family reunion Texas had ever seen. Now I want you to go back and open up your writing journal so that you have the Tall Tales ankle chart in front of you. All right, so again, tall tales are a type of traditional tale that is strongly associated with the American frontier. The author includes humor, impossible events, and characters with like superhuman powers. And remember, I told you that we were going to look at the boxes and bullet structure. We learned about when we were doing thesis statement, reason, and evidence. Well, we are going to work together to prove that Pecos Bill and the Coyotes is a tall tale by using that same outline process together. So I want you to have your sheet of paper in front of you, and we are going to be doing this together. I'll give you just a minute to get that sheet of paper. Make sure your name is on it, but we're going to glue it in our journal here in a second. So first thing I'm going to do, and remember it's called boxes and bullets, is I am going to draw that first box for the thesis statement. So on your sheet of paper, you're going to draw that first box. And again, we're doing this to prove if Pecos Bill and the Coyotes is a tall tale. So my thesis is going to be, and I'm going to put it in quotes because it's a title, is Pecos Bill and the Coyotes quote, is a tall tale. There we go. And then I want to put the reasons and the evidence. So Pecos Bill and the Wile E. Coyote, and Wile E. Coyote, it's not a cartoon. Pecos Bill and the Coyotes is a tall tale. And I do want to make sure that I have a couple of reasons and a couple of pieces of evidence. So if I have 2 reasons, I want 2 pieces of evidence for every reason. If I have 3 reasons, I want 3 pieces of evidence. So I'm going to start out with reason number 1. Remember, it's boxes and bullets. So reason 1 is its purpose is to entertain and telling unlikely events along with likely events. So in this case, I'm going to write this down. We're going to give evidence of an unlikely event, and then we'll give evidence of a likely event. So go ahead and write this down with me. We're going to write its purpose. And if you notice, we're kind of following along with the Tall Tale anchor chart, and at the very top it says purpose. So we're focusing on that purpose first. So its purpose is to entertain telling unlikely events along with likely events. So reason number 1, its purpose is to entertain, telling unlikely events along with likely events. And remember, I said the cool thing is if you look at your anchor chart, you will see that we're starting with the purpose, right? So on that anchor chart, the very top, it says the purpose. And then in our first sentence, we mentioned that there was unlikely events and likely events. So we're going to find evidence for the unlikely and evidence for the likely. So evidence number 1. Make my other bullet, evidence. And that first piece of evidence was Pecos Bill was raised by coyotes. Is that really something that's going to happen? No, you're right. It's not. A coyote is not going to raise a baby. So we're going to write the unlikely evidence is that Pecos Bill was raised by coyotes. All right, so evidence number 1, the unlikely event is that Pecos Bill was raised by coyotes. Makes for a great story, but it's not real. The next thing I'm going to do, the next piece of evidence is going to be my likely events evidence. And what's likely is that traveling in a covered wagon. You should know from your histories, social studies and history lessons, that they traveled by covered wagons before cars were invented, and even before everybody could afford a car, they traveled with wagon, and some of them were covered and some of them were not. So it is likely that they were traveling in a covered wagon. That did not. Ooh. So it is likely they traveled in a covered wagon. So our first paragraph for our literary essay in this situation is going to be Pecos Bill and the Coyotes is a tall tale. Its purpose is to entertain, telling unlikely events along with likely events. Our evidence for the unlikely is Pecos Bill was unlikely, so it's unlikely that Pecos Bill was raised by coyotes. And then evidence for the likely events is that it is likely they traveled in a covered wagon. So you have the piece of the fictional story and the piece of what could really happen. So you have the outrageous piece and then you have the real piece, which is a part of being a tall tale. Okay, so now let's go to reason number 2. And I'm going to try to fit this on mine. I may not be able to, but we're about to figure it out. So reason 2. Reason 2 is it includes elements of tall tales. And remember, when we go back and we look at that anchor chart that we have our journal open to, we started out with the purpose and now we're looking at the elements. And if you take a look at the elements, you can see various different ones. And we are going to talk about a hyperbole, which, remember, the first one, a hyperbole, is an exaggerated event that ends up sounding pretty humorous. So, a reason number 2 is it includes elements of tall tales. So I'm looking back. I started with my reason number 1, looking at some purpose. Reason number 2, I'm looking at some elements of tall tales, just kind of tying in what we talked about. And then the first, and I could choose from one of those 5 elements off of the anchor chart for the evidence for this tall tales. And we'll have to keep this open as we're doing the independent writing part of it, okay? So the first element, which turns out to be my first piece of evidence, is that it's a hyperbole. It includes a hyperbole. So evidence number 1 is hyperbole. The example of the hyperbole, and I'm going to quote, remember we talked about quoting evidence from our actual story, is bounced right out of the back of the covered wagon. Is a baby really going to bounce right out of the back of a covered wagon? So he bounced so high, he bounced out of the covered wagon. It's kind of funny, isn't it? I personally think it's funny. Actually, I think it's really funny. And then our evidence number 2 is, it's another element, that it's told in conversation style. It's told in a conversation style. So I am a little bit out of room. So I want you to keep going down your page. And if you've ran out of room on your page, I want you to flip it over and write on the back. I cannot do that with my computer right now. I can't just flip it over and write it on the back. That would be kind of silly. So I'm actually going to come over here and start with my next piece of evidence for the elements of a tall tale. And my next piece of evidence is that it's written in conversation style. And I'm actually going to go back up and I'm going to underline, because I'm actually going to end up quoting this as well. And we've talked about that, quoting evidence from our passage. But the very first thing I read was, now you've all probably heard some things about Pecos Bill. Like, that's what I might say when I'm having a conversation with you. Actually, I probably have said it to you. So I'm going to quote that. That's going to be my evidence for it being an element of a tall tale, is that it's written in conversation style. So my proof is, now you've probably heard some things about Pecos Bill. Let me see if I can spell that right. There we go. Pecos Bill. There you go. So, covered two elements. The first one is a hyperbole is included. The second one is that it's written in conversation style. But you know what? I'm going to go ahead and include a third one, because this tall tale is just full of some cool evidence and I want to use it. So the next one is going to be, the character has some superhuman abilities, right? Pecos Bill does some things that I'm not sure any other human could do. So character has superhuman powers or superhuman capabilities. Has some superhuman abilities. And what are those superhuman abilities? Well, if I can go back into my reading, it tells us, like even in the first paragraph, or maybe you've heard of the story about him shooting stars out of the sky. That is impossible for a human like you and me. That's just too far away. So superhuman abilities like shooting stars out of the sky. Kind of cool. So, again, remember, when we were reading this story, we knew that we were going to be doing a boxes and bullets, and we did a boxes and bullets that's proving that Pecos Bill and the Coyotes is a tall tale. Now, it did take us a few minutes, which means that when you go to do yours, it's going to take you a couple of minutes as well. I want you to take the sample that we just did together, and I know that you just glued down your anchor chart on page 10. I would like for you to glue this sample that we did together. I just modeled for you the expectation for when you do your own version of the boxes and bullets on the story that I am going to give you in just a minute. I totally forgot to tell you to glue this modeled version of the boxes and bullets that we did onto page 11 so that we don't lose it for future references. We're going to be using it more and more as we go through different types of genres and stories. So take a moment and glue it down onto page 11 in your writing journal.